Hi, and welcome to my introduction to the Fire Safety Residential Evacuation Plans England Regulations 2025. These regulations came into force on the 6th of April 2026 and introduce new requirements for residential premises containing two or more sets of domestic dwellings, taking into account both the height and the evacuation strategy. Now, before we get started, I want to add a little disclaimer in this that the visuals throughout have been mainly created by an AI. I've not created these visuals myself. I'm not an expert on that. My expertise is in the fire safety field. Yeah, but you can have an opinion on AI. My opinion is that it's a useful tool, provided that it's used in the correct way. So I have used that. I will continue to use that because I think it's a really good tool. So we're going to be covering a range of topics within this legislation. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to go over significant detail of specifics, such as the PCFRA, which is the person-centered fire risk assessment. We will go around the legal requirements of that, but it's not going to be a session that teaches you how to undertake a PCFRA, and help you become competent necessarily. But it does provide a bit of guidance on how you can go about that. So I'm Bradley Ashworth. This is my presentation. I'm an advanced fire risk assessor. I'm a senior fire risk assessor with the University of Manchester. I'm also an independent fire risk assessor and a fire safety trainer as well. I've got my advanced registration with the barcode at the bottom. I also have the same again at the end of this presentation. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. So we first of all start off with a bit of a background to these regulations. And in June 2017, a fire broke out at Grenfell Tower on the fourth floor of a residence flat. The fire ripped through the combustible external wall system and entered the communal area due to non-compliant fire doors that were largely not self-closing. There was lots of other non-conformities as well, but they were two big key driving factors. Now, the stay put policy failed largely due to inadequacy of fire precautions, and the failing in fire safety measures caused 72 people to lose their lives. Now, when we break down the 72 people that passed away at Grenfell Tower, or at least that's what we know of, 40 of those were adults with no known disabilities. 17 of the 67 children that were known to live at Grenfell Tower perished. And 42% of Grenfell Tower's disabled residents perished in the fire. Now, an accurate number of residents is unknown, and therefore there may be more people with certain misrepresented characteristics. This case is a real eye opener that disabled people are misrepresented, particularly in general use or general needs blocks of flats. And that's really what this regulation is trying to sort of help with. No, I don't think for one second these regulations are going to prevent, fire deaths from happening, but it does go a long way in at least assisting with that, and hopefully reducing those numbers. So when an incident does happen, hopefully we don't see a large proportion of disabled people perishing in a fire, particularly in comparison to the other people that live in the building. So that was a big statistic at Grenfell Tower. There's a huge disproportion of the disabled people perished. So The Grenfell Tower inquiry, phase 1, found that there was no plans to evacuate should the need arise, and therefore a number of recommendations were made, including all high-rise residential premises to have evacuation plans and keep them under regular review. Every high-rise residential premises be required to prepare PEEPs for all residents whose self-evacuation may be compromised. So the government accepted all of those recommendations. I mean, there was more than that, but it was that they're just two big key ones regarding this. But largely, these regulations, they actually exceed what the inquiry was set out to, well, was recommended. And the reason for that is because 11 meters in height buildings have actually become in scope, dependent on if they're on a simultaneous evacuation, and of course if they are a residential building, which will go on to the scope on the next slide. But so yeah, it just shows that the government have actually gone one step further. My view is that, you know, I mean, I know there's lots of opinions around our industry, and I'm not saying mine is definitely the correct one in comparison to maybe somebody else, but my opinion is that it still hasn't gone far enough. But there you go. So anyway, we then had the government's EEIS Plus consultation, which consisted of the government asking the industry for their ideas on how to safeguard occupants of residential premises when those occupants struggle to self-evacuate. And back then, we had some guidance documents such as the LGA Purpose-Built Blocks of Flats Guide, PAS 79-2, and similar guidance as well that I can't think off the top of my head, that did have guidance within it about evacuation of disabled people, but it wasn't fit for purpose. And only in hindsight, we look at that now and go, yeah, actually, that was really bad. And the government admitted that, you know, when they took away the guidance document from a situ and re-released it originally by just blacking out the advice regarding disabled people, which again wasn't really, I suppose it was better than inadequate advice, but it really wasn't helpful for a fire risk assessor giving out advice basing it on legal guidance. So they brought out this consultation, and the industry and potential bodies and stuff got involved and gave ideas on how to safeguard people who may struggle to evacuate in blocks of flats. So now we've got the new regulations. After consultation with the industry and the relevant bodies, the government introduced the Fire Safety Residential Evacuation Plans England Regulations 2025. These impose new requirements for specified premises to safeguard residents. Now, amongst these regs, there is new guidance on how to comply with the regulations, as well as BS 9792, which is largely regarding residential fire risk assessments. However, does have information that can be helpful for responsible persons to comply with the new regs. So the scope of the new regulations is one that's caused a little bit of controversy within the housing sector and within the fire industry. And the first thing we need to do to identify is we need to see if there's two or more sets of domestic premises. If it's a single domestic family dwelling, then these regulations are not likely to be applicable. So houses are out the scope. If it's a single tower block with multiple self-contained flats, then these regulations are likely going to apply, provided they meet the rest of the scope. So two or more sets of domestic premises, that can be and is, in most cases, inside one block. So it's not the block itself when it's speaking about the domestic premises, it's the actual flat that individual lives in. So in that case, it does apply to quite a wide range of buildings in the UK. Well, in England. So Next, we identify the height or stories of the building. Is it 18 meters in height or is it 7 stories? If so, then the building falls within the scope despite the evacuation policy. Not forgetting that we are still speaking about residential buildings here. So 18 meters or above, or 7 stories or above, whichever comes first, that falls within the scope regardless. And we measure the height in line with the approved document V. So if a building is under 18 meters or 7 stories, we then check whether it's at least 11 meters high. So if it's 11 meters in height and it's on a simultaneous evacuation, then that brings that building into scope. If it's 11 meters in height and less than 18 meters in height on simultaneous, the building is within scope. However, if it's on stay put, then it's no longer within scope. If a building is less than 11 meters in height, then the building will not fall within the scope unless they have managed to build a 7-story within 11 meters, which is it doesn't exist. I'm just being a bit silly. I don't think anyone would achieve that. Maybe if you're building they'll build it for mice, then potentially. So my take on this scope is that there's little difference in the event of a fire for a vulnerable resident on the 2nd floor of a high-rise residential premises and the 2nd floor of a 3-story residential premises. I understand that there is a higher chance of a fire when there are more people and there may be more people needing to evacuate, but that doesn't change the risk to that resident with extra needs. We also need to be mindful of the existing legislation. We already have legal requirements in place to safeguard relevant persons. Given that previous guidance has been widely recognised as inadequate in fully safeguarding vulnerable residents, responsible persons must be satisfied that they are protecting vulnerable residents in blocks of flats of all sizes. In my view, the guidance supporting the legislation provides the clearest and most robust way for responsible persons to demonstrate that they are meeting their legal duties. So that's my view on it. That yes, okay, you don't fall within the scope, but you do fall within this. Just because you don't fall within the scope of this doesn't mean you don't fall within the scope of the fire safety order. So you need to do something to safeguard the disabled occupants of the smaller buildings. So this is a methodology that you could use. Now, I think any enforcing authority would struggle to impose these regulations on buildings that fall outside the scope, but they could use existing legislation should they find that disabled people are being neglected in buildings outside the scope. And that's where I think that the government have made maybe a bit of a mistake. There could be a counter argument to that, but that is my view on it. So, and another key thing as well, it excludes military premises and domestic premises within the Palace of Westminster. So that's that. So now we have the relevant resident, which is described within the regulations as a person who is a resident of a domestic premises in a specified residential building, where the domestic premises are that person's only or principal residence, and whose ability to evacuate the building without assistance in the event of a fire is compromised as a result of a cognitive or physical impairment or condition. Now, lots of people get confused with this definition. The relevant resident may have more than one home, and that's completely fine. For the responsible person to implement these regulations as required to a resident, they must have the premises down as their main residence. So they can have a holiday home, they can have other homes, provided that this particular premises is their main place where they live. So the reason for using the principal residence framework is really about focus and proportionality. These measures are designed to be thorough and tailored, so they're prioritised for residents who actually call the building their main home, rather than spreading responsibilities too widely for landlords and managing agents. If a resident does not wish to share their personal information, then they are not required to do so. And that's something that's throughout the regulations is repeated, and it's repeated in these slides for good reason. Residents' consent for participation is required, and they have full control over who you can share the information with. The resident may wish to appoint a representative or a trusted person. Now, this is key. So, in line with Regulation 11, a representative is a person with parental responsibility for the relevant resident, or where a relevant resident lacks capacity in relation to the matters to which the provision sets out, the representative can be the attorney under a registered enduring power of attorney which relates to that resident, the don of a lasting power of attorney which relates to that resident, or a deputy appointed in relation to that resident by the Court of Protection. Now, as for the trusted person, this doesn't actually appear in the regulations. However, it does appear in the legal guidance produced in line with these regulations under Section 5 of the Residential Peeps Guidance. That mentions the trusted person. The guidance makes it clear that a relevant resident may wish to appoint a person which they trust to be in the conversations relevant to the resident. If the trusted person does not meet the criteria of a representative, then the relevant resident must be present during the meetings. And there's the big key difference between the two. So a trusted person can be appointed by the relevant resident, and that can be literally anyone, but they have to be present. So the relevant resident has to be present in those conversations, whereas the representative, they can have these conversations without the relevant resident being present. The guidance also mentions that responsible persons should work in conjunction with staff that are already involved with the resident. Now, again, it's up to the resident whether they wish to allow them to be part of those conversations. But as a responsible person, we should be encouraging the resident in the reasons for getting those individuals involved. But ultimately, it's the resident's decision, and if they say no, then that's the end of it. So we can simplify compliance by breaking it down into 6 clear steps. So step 1, we've got identify. So the responsible person should take reasonable steps to identify a resident who may need support. This is not a one-off task. It's an ongoing task, and it should happen when someone moves in, through regular reminders, or whenever a resident comes forward. And we'll go into a bit more detail a bit later on. Step 2, so once a resident is identified, we need to understand their situation. This is done through a person-centered fire risk assessment, which looks at how the individual needs may affect their ability to evacuate that specific building. Now we go to step 3, which is about mitigation. After understanding the risks, the next step is to consider what can be put in place to reduce them. Measures should be practical, proportionate, and focused on improving safety. Now, proportionality is massive regarding the mitigation, and there's a slide explaining it a bit more, and you'll realise when we come to it, this just how significant the being practicable and proportionate is absolutely fundamental. But then we've got step 4, which is another key one again, the agree statement. So or the evacuation statement, should we say. So the responsible person and the resident should agree what will happen in the event of a fire. This should be recorded clearly as an evacuation statement and shared with the resident. That's a must. So at the end of your PCFRA, you will have come up with an agreement on how they're going to evacuate, and that's called the evacuation statement. That has to be shared with the resident. Now, where the resident agrees, so this is step 5, where the resident agrees, key information should be shared with the fire and rescue service. This ensures they have full information to support in the event of an emergency. And then step 6, the whole process should be kept under review. This should happen regularly and whenever circumstances change. So it's 12 months as a minimum. And ultimately, if something changes or if a resident comes forward, then that needs to be reviewed. And that's the entire process. So we'll go into a bit more detail on these points. So these are on this slide. These are 3 principles that help ensure the process stays within the legal boundaries of the regulations. To make sure the residential PEEP process is practical, respects privacy, and remains focused on life safety. So, as you can see in the illustration, the process is based on a simple conversation. The responsible person is not asking for a medical history. They're asking what risks relate to the resident's impairment and their ability to evacuate this specific building. And then we've got the resident who's explaining that they can and they can't do this in relation to the building's normal evacuation arrangements. And that conversation is shaped on 3 key principles. So we've got the first one, which is focus on fire safety, not diagnosis. So the responsible person needs to understand how an impairment affects evacuation, not the medical condition itself. For example, they may need to know that a resident cannot hear the alarm or may need assistance on stairs, but they do not need to know the clinical reason behind it. Then we've got no requirement for medical records. So there is no requirement for a resident to provide medical records or private health documents. The responsible person still needs enough information to understand the risk, but this should come from discussion with the resident rather than a formal medical evidence. And then we've got the final one, collaborative approach. So this approach is based on working together. It is not about imposing a solution. It is about identifying the risks and agreeing a practical plan that will work in an emergency. This is then recorded in the emergency evacuation statement specific for that person. So by following these principles, the process remains focused on safety, respects the resident's privacy, and produces a plan that is practical and workable. So I've made this matrix version, but yeah, so step 3, mitigation, and that brings us on to reasonable and proportionate cost matrix. Now, I'm not a fan of this personally, or professionally for that matter, but this is what the regulations do have in place, and I understand it, but I'm just still not. I'm not fully, a fan of it. But okay. So under Regulation 7, the responsible person has a mandatory duty to implement measures that are reasonable and proportionate to mitigate the risks. Whether a measure meets this reasonable threshold often depends on the context of the building and the practicality of the mitigation and who is expected to pay for it. So we've got the responsible person pays. These are measures where the cost falls to the building owner or manager. This typically includes general building-wide fire precautions or items the responsible person is already required to provide under existing law. We've then got shared cost. So these are measures that benefit the majority of the residents for the time being, such as improved wayfinding signage or communal handrails. These costs shared amongst all residents, typically via service charges or leaseholder mechanisms. And finally, we've got when the resident pays. So these are highly specific mitigations for an individual's needs, such as a vibrating smoke alarm inside a private flat. In these cases, the responsible person facilitates the work, but the individual bears the cost. So the individual shouldn't be going out and purchasing it themselves. It should be the responsible person, but then the resident actually pays for that. So we've got the refusal clause under Regulation 7. I think it's paragraph 3, but I could be wrong on that. But it's definitely under Regulation 7. So if we look at the red box towards the bottom of the slide, it highlights that clause. So it states that if a measure is deemed reasonable, but the cost falls to the resident, and that resident declines to pay, the responsible person is not legally required to implement it. This ensures that residents are never forced to pay for safety equipment they do not want, while also protecting the responsible person from liability for measures they cannot fund. Finally, while the mitigation process is collaborative, the sources clarify that the responsible person holds the final decision-making power on which measures are truly reasonable and proportionate for their specific buildings. So, as mentioned earlier, we have the emergency evacuation statement. So this is quite a big important part. So, as the slide indicates, this statement is the conclusion of a PCFRA, it's person-centered fire risk assessment. It is a personalized protocol that details exactly what the resident has agreed to do if a fire occurs. One of the most important things to know is that this statement is not dependent on physical mitigations. Even if no new equipment is installed, the resident still requires written agreement. Now, under Regulation 8, there are 4 specific legal requirements for this document. So for the evacuation statement, it needs to be in writing. Verbal agreements do not satisfy the statutory duty. It must be agreed, so the responsible person must use reasonable endeavours to reach an agreement with the resident or their representative on the approach to evacuation. It must be clear and brief. This is not a complex legal contract. It's a safety tool. It's meant to be a concise statement, and it will ensure rapid recall for the resident during a fire situation, which can be quite stressful. So clear and brief and concise. And then finally, a copy must be provided. So the responsible person has a mandatory duty to provide the resident directly with a copy of their statement for their own records. While there is no prescribed government format, the statement should include any specific arrangements, such as a neighbour or volunteer who has agreed to provide assistance. This ensures that the resident's specific plan is documented and understood by all parties before an incident occurs. Now, if a neighbour or a volunteer is part of that plan, well, you have also got to consider on that review process, which we'll come on to again, but that review process, what if the neighbour moves out? Or God forbid, what if the neighbour has an issue where they also become a relevant resident? So these are things that, as a responsible person, it's extremely difficult to flag out. So we've identified the resident, conducted the assessment, and agreed on a statement. So now we address the final critical step, getting the information into the emergency services. So as you can see by the lock icon, data sharing is strictly subject to the explicit agreement of the relevant resident. The responsible person has a legal duty to share specific data points with the fire service, but they must not do so unless the resident has given consent specifically to share it with the fire service. It's important to remind residents that they are free to withdraw the consent at any time. Now, responsible persons are encouraged to explain the benefits of sharing this information with the fire service, such as, if the fire service know about it, then they can respond much more efficiently to safeguard that resident in the event of a fire. Now, that encouragement is just encouragement to try and see if the resident can reconsider, but it is ultimately up to the resident, and there should be no negative consequences to the resident's position in that premises for refusal to give consent of sharing that information. So as part of this then is there's 4 prescribed data points. So the resident's flat number, the resident's floor number, basic information regarding the degree of assistance required, and confirmation of whether they have an emergency evacuation statement. So those things are what the fire service need to be aware of. So that's what needs to be shared, and yeah, so that's pretty much it for the fire service to be able to show that they've got enough information about that resident. So Regulation 13 requires the responsible person to prepare a strategic document for the premises as a whole, and that's referred to as the Building Emergency Evacuation Plan. So you may have heard people call it BEEPs. We've got Jeeps, we've got Peeps, and we've got Beeps. So it's messing up my slides. So this is the Building Emergency Evacuation Plan. Under Regulation 13, if you are a responsible person for a building in scope, you have a mandatory legal duty to prepare a separate building-wide evacuation plan. This document acts as a high-level summary to ensure that the fire and rescue service has an immediate, accurate overview of the building safety strategy. This document is not to be shared with residents as it may contain personal data protected under the GDPR laws. According to the regulations, this plan must include 3 specific elements. So first is instruction to residents. So a copy of the actual evacuation strategy shared with the residents. So for example, whether the building operates a stay put policy or it's on simultaneous evacuation. Then we've got relevant residents. So it's not specific, but it's a confirmation of whether there are any residents in the building who have identified themselves as needing assistance. And then we have the building systems. So details of any building-wide evacuation facilities, such as the location of an evacuation alert system or protocols for evacuation lifts. So those are 3 things that need to be in that plan. So the responsible person is legally required to share the building level plan with the fire authority. Additionally, if the building has a secure information box, a copy of this plan must be placed inside of it. Now, again, given the GDPR laws, that information box does need to actually be secure. A lot of these information boxes that we see, sometimes they're not very well secured. So that's something to be looking out for if you're a responsible person. And then we have finally, the plan is a living document, so it must be reviewed at least every 12 months or sooner if there is a reason to believe it is no longer accurate. So this slide's mainly around about what the fire safety officers or fire risk assessors might look out for. And I say fire risk assessors, but it ultimately depends on what type of assessment they're doing and how much consultation they're actually giving. So when a fire officer arrives on site to audit the premises, they won't just look for the existence of a plan. They'll look for the quality of the process behind it. The first thing an officer should be looking for is the responsible person's approach to the reasonable endeavours. So, is the responsible person genuinely trying to identify relevant residents? An auditor will look for evidence of the approach, such as moving in packets, annual reminders, and then targeted campaigns as well for showing residents what's on offer and then for them to come forward. If the responsible person is relying on a single buried email he sent a few years ago, then they're unlikely to be meeting the statutory standard for identifying those in need. So next we have the review cycle. So person-centered fire risk assessments and emergency statements, evacuation statements must be reviewed at least every 12 months. However, the lookout is that they must also be reviewed immediately if building conditions change or if a resident's needs evolve. A fire officer will check the dates of these documents to ensure that they're current. And then a third lookout is the secure information box. It isn't enough to just have a box. It must actually contain an updated building evacuation plan, or a BEEP, and the prescribed resident data. And equally, it must be secure. And finally, we have consent trails, because data sharing is strictly consensual. So the responsible person must be able to prove that the resident agreed to the data being stored in the secure information box and shared with the fire service. If that consent cannot be evidenced, the responsible person is in a position of legal risk regarding both fire safety and probably more so the GDPR regs. So while the previous slide focused on what an officer looks for, this slide addresses like actual common misconceptions or pitfalls, if you like. So that responsible persons frequently fall into. So these examples show how a plan that looks good on paper can fundamentally fail in practice. And so we've got the first one. So the first pitfall is applying commercial logic. On paper, a responsible person might submit a complex 20-page workplace style PEEP. In practice, this fails. Residential blocks typically lack 24/7 staffing and total building control found in a commercial office. An evacuation strategy that relies on a fire warden who doesn't exist at 3 a.m. is not going to be viable and is actually quite dangerous. We've then got next one, which is forcing medical disclosure. We sometimes see responsible persons demanding a doctor's note or formal NHS records before they will agree to complete a PCFRA. In practice, this is in my view, it's an illegal overreach. So the new regulations are clear. The assessment is about evacuation capability, what the resident can and cannot do, not a clinical diagnosis. So demanding medical history as a barrier to safety is a significant compliance failure. And you might be thinking, oh, well, these regs have only just come out. There can't be that many responsible persons with these common misconceptions. PCFRAs, person-centered fire risk assessments, have been around for longer than these regulations have existed. The NFCC specialised housing guidance has had it in there for, well, I was in school when it first came out, but for as long as I've been using the NFCC specialised housing guide, it's made a mention of PCFRAs. So so that's that. And then pitfall 3. The final pitfall involves compromising escape routes. So on paper, a responsible person might feel they've solved the problem by letting a resident purchase their own heavy evacuation equipment. In practice, this can be a violation of the Article 14 means of escape under the fire safety order. If that equipment obstructs the communal hallways or prevents others from escaping, it's created a new hazard. So the responsible person must manage overall building safety and ensure that one person's mitigation doesn't become another person's barrier. So got to be careful of that. And you know, there's potential for other breaches there. I thought that was a good example, the Article 14. You know, mainly because it's you could see that happening. But either way, when residents are left to buy their own, then there could be other compliance issues there. So, you know, those were some of the common misconceptions that a responsible person should try and avoid. So we now need to look at the British Standard 9792. So that's the latest British standard for fire risk assessments in housing. Now, as the blueprint illustration shows, there is a clear distinction between the law and the British standard. The law sets the statutory requirement. It tells you tells you that you must identify relevant residents and you must conduct a PCFRA if requested. 9792 is more of a professional code of practice, and whilst it's not specific to these regulations, it does have some good stuff for responsible persons to use that could support them in compliance with these regulations. So it provides a little bit of a how. So there's two really good tools within 9792. Oh, didn't mean to do that. So yeah, the two tools are within Annex A. So we'll start off with Annex A. So this provides a detailed 9-step pro forma for conducting a person-centered fire risk assessment, PCFRA. It guides the responsible person through every stage, from determining resident characteristic to establishing a review period, ensuring that no safety question could be overlooked. Then we've got Annex D. So that's a comprehensive map of occupant characteristics. It identifies how specific conditions such as hearing impairments, cognitive difficulties, or bariatric needs functionally impact a person's ability to respond to an alarm and evacuate. This prevents responsible persons from having to guess the impact of a condition and provides an expert-backed basis for design. Now, one thing to be mindful of, it's not foolproof, and actually you still have to have these open conversations with your resident about their specific needs, because even if someone has a very similar condition, how that impacts that individual could be very different. So for instance, you know, my sister is in a wheelchair, but she can climb down small amounts of stairs, whereas, you know, she has friends who are also in a wheelchair. They have similar issues with their legs, and they can't do any stairs at all. And then equally, they've got others that are fine with stairs. So you've got to consider the fact that yes, it's a similar disability, but actually, you know, they could be very different meanings. So that's why we still have to have those open conversations. So fire safety officers should look to the British standard as the benchmark to judge if a responsible person's methodology is sound and professional. However, it is essential to remember that while the standard informs a best practice, any formal enforcement action must be strictly based on the statutory requirement found in the regulations, not the British standard. The British standard is not necessarily the legal guidance. It's very much an industry recognized best practice. So that's take on that. So to conclude this section, we will look at how the various requirements of the regulations work together. So this diagram represents the statutory framework that connects the building management, the residents, and the emergency services. At the centre of this framework is the relevant resident. The entire process, from assessment to information sharing, is built around their specific safety needs and requires their explicit consent at every stage. The three surrounding circles represent entities with specific duties under the law. So the responsible person holds the primary duty to use reasonable endeavours to identify residents in need, offer and ensure the completion of a person-centred fire risk assessment, and implement reasonable and proportionate mitigating measures. Then, under Regulation 10, the fire service receives the prescribed data points regarding the relevant residents. This intelligence allows them to inform their operational response and, where necessary, assist the evacuation or rescue of residents who cannot leave the building unaided. Now, this is a key distinction between residential peeps and peeps within a commercial building. We can rely on the fire service to make a rescue, but we still look at this as a last resort and see what measures we can put in place to make a resident safer while they're either awaiting rescue, or if we can put things in place so that resident can actually evacuate the premises. So, whereas a commercial peep will rely on the responsible person having a plan to evacuate that individual without the need of the fire service evacuating them. And that is a thing that gets confused. I won't go too in detail today, but a lot of commercial RPs, responsible persons, do get confused. They think that it's enough to just take the individual to a refuge area and then wait for the fire service to rescue them. And the fire service will do a good job. You know, the typically competent firefighters out there that are more than willing to go rescue anybody from a premises, particularly in a refuge. But it is on the responsible person to evacuate that individual from the refuge area. That's not the same in residential. So there could potentially be no staff, and that's likely to be the case in the majority of cases, that there's no staff present to evacuate those residents. So you may have to rely on the fire service in a worst case scenario to evacuate that resident. But it's about, well, what can I do in that scenario? You know, would it be safer if if you're on stay put and that resident's, or even on simultaneous, that resident, you know, the relevant resident is probably better if their flat is on fire to see if they can evacuate to the same floor that they're on, but just to the communal space, or even in the stairwell, where at least then the flat entrance door, it's a fire resisting door that'll self close, and then potentially they've gone past the lobby door as well. They could potentially have two fire resisting barriers between them and the fire while they're awaiting rescue. You know, that's better than sitting in their flat that's potentially on fire. So the third one, sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent then. Third one is the fire and rescue service, acting in their capacity as the enforcing authority, audits the responsible person's compliance with these regulations. So they ensure that the building emergency evacuation plans and individual statements are current and that the responsible person is meeting their statutory obligations. And the fire risk assessor will probably do this on a private consultation view. But again, it does depend on what level of consultation you're getting off a fire risk assessor. The fire risk assessor ultimately, you know, they be focusing on the actual FRA itself, but there's a lot of different setups. So the arrows represent the provision of information mandated by the law. So by requiring the responsible person to prepare both a building emergency evacuation plan under Regulation 13 and individual emergency evacuation statements under Regulation 8, the regulations ensure that individual needs are no longer managed in isolation. One key takeaway from this is that fire safety for relevant residents should be done in conjunction with those residents. So it should be done for them and with them rather than at them. In the past, specific fire safety for residents was done at the resident. It wasn't really fit for purpose, and it was mainly based on assumptions. Whereas this is more based on working with the resident and coming to an agreed conclusion about how they are going to safely evacuate. So do it for them and with them, not to them. So as noted in the footer, this framework shifts the fire safety approach away from passive assumptions and towards a model of active engagement and documented agreement between all parties. So this is a really good slide for responsible persons. So several tools have been produced and established, and if you'd like, you could scan the barcode there in the top corner, and that will take you, or should take you, to the responsible person's toolkit. Now, that's provided that the government's kept it in the same place that it was in when I put the barcode up, not the barcode, the QR code, and provided it's still being hosted. If you're watching this well down the line, then that may not work anymore. I'm not sure. The government has launched a dedicated responsible person toolkit. Now, this is a vital practical resource designed to help you move from theory to action. It contains real-world examples of PCFRAs that have been done by other responsible persons, and that what successful mitigation measures were put in place by that responsible person. It's important to clarify how disagreements should be handled under this new framework. While the local fire authority is the enforcing body for these regulations, they do not act as the arbitrator for disputes between the responsible person and the resident regarding specific assessments or costs. Disagreements concerning the reasonableness of a measure should be handled through your existing formal complaints procedure or a relevant ombudsman. Also, for specified buildings at least 18 metres in height, residents now have a statutory route through the building safety regulator. They can utilise the residents' voice complaints procedure if they believe their building's evacuation arrangements are not being managed correctly. So that's a really good tool for residents. It provides a tool for them to complain through recognised routes. And then as for the footer of the slide, compliance is not just about avoiding enforcement action or box ticking. The fundamental goal of these regulations is to shift the culture away from passive fire safety assumptions. By following this framework, we ensure that every relevant resident has an agreed written and viable pathway to safety in the event of a fire. Thanks for attending. I do hope you've enjoyed the session and you've learned something from the session. If there are any other topics you'd like me to cover during, then I'm quite happy to have a look to see if I can put some slides together. I've put some QR codes on this slide. One is for my National Fire Risk Assessor registration. I've also left a link to my LinkedIn if you would like to connect. If you're a responsible person and would like some support, get in touch. I can provide advice remotely or provide professional fire safety services, including high quality fire risk assessments at your premises. If there is anything else that I can help with, please leave your feedback in the comments. or message me directly on LinkedIn. But thanks for watching.